Everyone. My name is Faylene Beaubier. I'm a member of the Toronto East branch of the International Socialists, which is a group that has organized this half-day conference, Socialism in a Time of Pandemic, Ideas to Change the World. I'm just going to briefly explain the format of the conference today, but before we begin, I'd like to read the following land acknowledgement. As settlers, we acknowledge our occupation of lands that are the Indigenous territories of Turtle Island. Furthermore, we support all struggles for Indigenous sovereignty in whatever forms they take by the hundreds of First Nations and Inuit communities that have resided here for many thousands of years, and by Métis communities that have developed in the last hundreds of years. We know that some who routinely make land acknowledgements, such as our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, do so simply as a cover for despicable actions, such as continuing to allow multi-billion-dollar corporations to run roughshod over environmental protections and to continue building pipelines for profit on Indigenous territory. Land acknowledgements and solidarity must be more than words. I think that's why it's very hopeful to see, after the recent death of 37-year-old Indigenous woman, Joyce Echaquan in Quebec, that there have been solidarity vigils springing up across the country. Before her death, she videoed basically two healthcare workers making racist and awful comments to her while she was on her deathbed. But it's not simply a question of the individual actions of two healthcare workers, but a whole system of racism against Indigenous peoples, of stealing, a history of stealing their land, etc. So that's why we're also urging everyone to join the Pan-Canadian Day of Action in solidarity with the Six Nations Land Defenders, which is happening on Friday, October the 9th. The link for more information will be posted in the chat window, and there'll be other such links that will be posted during the conference today. So what we hope is that today's conference, Socialism in a Time of Pandemic, will be a place for all of us to come together and discuss the triple crises of the system that our current situation have laid bare. The triple crises of capitalism, the health crisis of the pandemic itself, which has laid bare in country after country the inadequate and criminal responses of our governments, the environmental crisis, which threatens all life on the planet and from which the pandemic emerged, and the resultant economic crisis, which has thrown millions of people across the world out of work and in danger of losing their ability to house and feed themselves and their families. But to paraphrase a famous anti-capitalist, the point is to change the world, not simply to understand it. So hopefully today will also be a discussion about how we can challenge the priorities of a system based on profit for the few at the expense of the many, and make sure that we don't return to a normal which has brought these crises down on us in the first place. So in terms of the format for today's discussions, there will be 3 sessions of approximately an hour and 10 minutes each, with a 10-minute break in between each session, and lots of time for discussion after each presentation. We would ask, if possible, that people mute themselves, and also, if you can, turn off your cameras, unless, of course, you're a speaker or the chair, just to save bandwidth. Also, I should let people know that the conference today is being recorded so that it can be posted online for people to see who were not able to attend. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over the mic or whatever to Alex Adams, who will be chairing the first session today. So take it away, Alex.
Yeah, hello and welcome. Like Faylene said, my name's Alex. I'm a member of the Toronto East branch, also of the International Socialists. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the meeting. the first meeting, which is on capitalism, COVID, and climate chaos. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming. As was mentioned by Faylene, just the format for the meeting is that we will have speakers giving a presentation at the beginning, and then we'll have a lot of room for discussion at the end. I'll be coming on just to let you know when we have our time for discussion, and just if you during the discussion, just technical note on if you want to speak, you can raise your hands. There's a raise hand button, and it may vary depending on what version of the Zoom application that you're using, but at the bottom of the Zoom window, or on the side in the chat window, if you make that displayed, or you can also indicate that you want to speak in the chat. So anyways, with that, we'll get started on the meeting. So our first speaker today for the first meeting is Chantal Sundaram, who is a member of the International Socialists, a member of Quebec Solidaire, and a longtime activist in anti-racist, anti-Islamophobic, and labor movements. So without further ado, I'll give it over to Chantal.
Thanks. Thanks, Alex, and thank you, everyone. So I'm going to try to give an intro to help frame the whole discussion that we're going to have this afternoon, because what we're talking about are interlocking crises of capitalism. And in this session, I am going to sort of split the intro with my comrade Zain, who's going to talk more about the question of climate chaos. I'm going to talk more about the economy, and both of us are going to talk about the impact of the pandemic, but it's really hard to separate these crises out in reality because they are so interlocking. So I'm going to say a few words about that. The roots of the pandemic itself are in environmental chaos, and a chaos created by capitalism, specifically industrialized agriculture and factory farming for profit, including wildlife farming. This is about the incursions of capitalist agriculture into wilderness and driving animal species from old habitats into new ones. And this is all something that can be traced back to large-scale agribusiness and capitalism in how it structures food production. I can't go into this in detail in the introduction, but maybe we could post in the chat an article that does. It's called Socialism in a Time of Pandemics. And it traces this history. And I want to emphasize that the title of that article is plural, in a time of pandemics, because it is about the fact that this pandemic is not an anomaly. It has reasons for its occurrence that have not been addressed. And so we can anticipate that the capitalist production of food is going to keep this a reality in our lives. The article also provides a brief history of previous pandemics that really shows the social dimensions of pandemics and who suffers from the most, and how each time these kind of diseases have ripped through humanity, it exposes the pre-existing inequalities that society was living with previously. And that's no different today, of course. The pandemic has only exposed and intensified the pre-existing inequalities of capitalist society, whether income and class inequality or racial inequality. And the absolute naked truth that is now visible to all is that after age and health, race and class are the key determinants of who lives and who dies in a pandemic. While the conditions have caused a specific economic crisis, the capitalist economy was already in crisis when the pandemic began, for reasons that were independent but were worsened by it. And the pandemic has merely exposed the chronic and criminal underfunding of healthcare over decades of neoliberal attacks on public services internationally, but also in Canada, which supposedly has the best healthcare system that capitalism has to offer. The pandemic has not changed the fundamental dynamic of the system to pursue profit at all costs, and in fact has accelerated the already enormous divide between rich and poor on a global scale, with pre-existing food insecurity in the global south increasing with the pandemic, but also within the wealthier countries of the West. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit now, is the question of the economy and class inequality. There's no doubt that the rich have been getting richer for a while, but there should be also no doubt that the pandemic has not changed that. As we've seen the lives of people, ordinary people, working people, and the poor ravaged, those especially who are already in underpaid and precarious jobs, but also whole new layers of unemployment and precarity being created. The truth is, we are not all in this together. And the most recent proof of that is the Forbes list, the big media celebrator of capitalist wealth, Forbes magazine, recently reported that America's super rich are doing better than ever. The aggregate wealth of its top 400 list is up 8% from a year ago and has now set a record in the 4 decades that Forbes has been tracking the richest Americans' fortunes. Chief executive of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, is up 57% from last year. Others to profit from the pandemic include the chief executive of Zoom Video Communications, which we are on at the moment. Now, you can bet that none of these people are going to pay tax on this enormous wealth to fund healthcare and economic safety for the unemployed and underemployed and those whose lives have been destroyed by the pandemic. In fact, tax avoidance, in addition to profit making, explains their obscene wealth. In case you were worried that Canadian capitalists were missing out on this bonanza, you can be assured that they are not. And this was actually laid bare in a parliamentary budget officer report during the summer, which indicated that the top 1,600 families in Canada have nearly 6 times the combined wealth of the poorest 6 million families. And what's even more shocking about this is when you think about what it means in terms of what payments could be available for healthcare and employment insurance. The staggering comparison is that the $654 billion owned by the richest 0.01% is more than twice the total federal government revenues for 2017 and 18, and that is the equivalent of 33 years of EI benefit payments, or 18 years of federal payments for healthcare. That is the reality in Canada, but I have to emphasize, this is not a story of pandemic profiteers. They are capitalist profiteers. For sure, we can get justifiably angry about Zoom and Amazon and people in the upper echelons who made conscious decisions to try to profit from the pandemic, but it's not actually just about that. It's not exceptional. It's an extension of the normal dynamic of capitalism. And what explains this vast accumulation of wealth is actually the control of the means of production that forces most of us to sell our labor. The way that the system requires production for profit and the accumulation of capital to be successful within the structure of this economy. And that is not a creation of the pandemic. So what explains this whole situation is not primarily greed, though don't get me wrong, there's a lot of that, but it is the systemic organization of production for profit and the need to exploit human labor to generate that profit. This doesn't mean we shouldn't get angry about some of the immediate results that we're seeing during the pandemic, but it also means we have to step back and look at what it's going to take to challenge it. What we did see at the beginning of this pandemic is something that I think is important to keep in mind. We saw what many people thought was a temporary suspension of the rules of capitalism. If you remember hearing Justin Trudeau come on the radio or on TV every day, promising new money for those struggling and talking about Canadian corporations selflessly pledging themselves to the social cause of producing PPE, well, for some, it did seem like a temporary suspension of the normal rules. We are now clearly back to the naked rules that appeared to be suspended temporarily, but really weren't. And the essential workers who were touted as heroes are now back to being as expendable as always. It's hard to even remember now that there was a moment when Galen Weston, the owner, CEO of Loblaws, provided a temporary wage subsidy to grocery workers who are on the front lines of the pandemic. Well, I mean, that lasted all of 5 minutes. It was gone almost as soon as it appeared. The other thing that explains both the exponential growth of capitalist wealth of the last 4 decades, and which also explains the unpreparedness of healthcare systems the world over to deal with the pandemic, is the neoliberal economics and more recent austerity measures that have drained money away from public services over the last 4 decades, really, and funneled it upwards through cuts to capital gains tax. The irony is this economic course of action was embarked on in the late 70s and 80s as a way to try to deal with an international economy that had returned to recurring crisis after a long period of boom following the Second World War, as an attempt to restore profit rates from a long decline of profits. And this meant a whole series of measures to lower the cost of labor by cheapening its worth in wages and squeezing more work out of all of us. There were only fleeting moments, though, in these last 4 decades, where that seemed to work at all against capitalist stagnation, and even then it was uneven on a global scale. There was a little moment in the mid-2000s that had people thinking that maybe we've beaten the cycle of recurring recessions and ever weaker recoveries, and then came the crash of 2008. So I'm giving you a bit of this history because this is really what led to the fact that the economy was already in a weak state before the pandemic hit. It's very, very possible to say that we were not out of the economic crash and crisis that ensued after 2008, 2009. It became very clear that any so-called recovery was fueled by huge amounts of credit and therefore debt instead of real productive growth. So again, this is history that's too detailed to tell. There's also another article that could be placed in the chat called Triple Crisis that goes through some of this history and what happened to the economy. But I think what's important to say is that as we entered the pandemic, this was the weakened state that it was already in, and coupled with intercapitalist rivalries that actually right before the pandemic took the form of an oil war between Russia and Saudi Arabia. But now the two economic crises have fused. And the result, of course, is going to be and has been more corporate bailouts. The scale of state intervention in the massive corporate bailouts before posed the question of who's going to pay for all of this. And that is the question that is going to be posed and is being posed again today. This corporate welfare strategy comes with a price tag, and now the question is, will it be the rich who pay or will it be us? It shouldn't be us, but it likely will be without resistance. The CERB and other emergency measures masked temporarily the inadequacy of the employment insurance system, which was already inadequate to deal with pre-pandemic conditions of unemployment and underemployment. And as the rich get richer, they are certainly not going to step up to pay for anything. And as I mentioned, the hypocrisy of Galen Weston offering a pittance to frontline workers. Well, any employer that gave a break to their workers is going to find a way to claw that back now. The state will make us pay as well as the costs mount for dealing with the pandemic and recovery spending. All levels of government will try to get workers to pay by slashing healthcare and education and laying off workers and trying to lower wages. And this question of social programs is a really critical one because we know in the past that crisis has been used as a pretext to make structural change to the public services that people rely on, that working people rely on, which is really part of their social wage, the part that that private employers don't pay for, but that people depend on. All of this economic pressure is what pushed the premature reopening of the economy in Canada and other parts of the world. We've seen the disastrous results of that. We're now in the second wave of both the pandemic and of the capitalist response to it. And this wave will be worse domestically and globally. The economic instability is fueling a drive to international conflict and war, which is another pre-existing condition of the capitalist disease, but which can get worse. And we've seen growing conflict around the Mediterranean and Caucasus region recently over oil and gas interests, most recently between Russia and Turkey. The competitive pressure of capitalist states on one another forces the logic of profit making externally and internally. And the consequence in many countries will be a second wave of deaths from COVID, but also from all the secondary consequences of the pandemic. So I'm painting a bleak picture to start us off, but that's only because the rest of the discussion this afternoon is actually going to be what we can do about it. Because the money is actually there to deal with all of this without a single layoff, without the violence and repression that we've seen from when people resist. How do we deal with that situation during a pandemic? What are the fault lines that we can exploit on our side? 2019 was rocked by anti-system conflicts around the world. And just before the pandemic, Canada was rocked by railway blockades in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en. And of course, during the worst of the pandemic itself, Black Lives Matter showed the kind of massive resistance that is still possible. So I'm going to leave it at that because I know that Zain is going to talk about climate chaos and the resistance that's emerging to that. And then we will have the rest of the afternoon to talk about how we can build a movement for permanent and lasting resistance to change the system.
Okay, thank you, Chantal. Oh, forgot to turn my camera back on. Okay, thank you, Chantal. And we'll now have our second speaker, Zain Al-Haq, who is a Vancouver organizer with Extinction Rebellion, part of the Action and Strategy team, and a member of the Vancouver branch of the International Socialists. So I will turn it over to you.
Thanks. So I'll just start with talking about something that's in common when it comes to the pandemic and the climate crisis and capitalism. And the thing in common with all three of these is that the manner in which they get worse, because when it comes to economic growth, it's not something that, for example, the US can't be happy with just being on 2%. It needs to go from 2 to 4 or 4 to 5. And it needs to grow not just in a linear manner, it needs to grow exponentially. And that's what's common between the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, and capitalism, which is that they're both supposed to get worse just because of their built-in nature in an exponential manner. And it would have been a massive crisis if they just got worse. But the way in which the climate crisis works is that people tend to assume that it's going to be like 31 degrees and 32 degrees and then 33, when in fact it's more like 31 to 35. And then you have something like 10 9/11s equivalent to the climate crisis that take place. And so there's something when it comes to opposing the system, there's a problem generally in the Western context of social movements, which is something that you could call Western social movement fatigue. And this tends to sort of hinder progress when it comes to resisting capitalism and the crises that are caused by capitalism. So if there's a social movement, people will be very skeptical about whether or not it will work, because there have been many movements in the recent decades in the US and the UK that haven't worked. And in the sense of not achieving the goals that they seek to achieve. And so there tends to be this tension about whether or not there can be success. And whether we look at Occupy or if you go back to the coal miner strikes in the UK, there tends to be this sort of self-doubt when it comes to social movements, that people tend to organize in a manner that there isn't a great deal of emphasis on revolutionary change, and there's sort of more of a focus on reform. And the problem with that, obviously, is that reforms can be undone by people who are left with the means to undo those reforms. And so therefore, if you need to make the reforms permanent, that process is called a revolutionary change. And so when it comes to the issue of the climate movement and sort of resisting capitalism and sort of doing something about it, there seems to be a problem in Canada with regards to a split that seems to exist between environmentalism that's usually done by groups that are predominantly Indigenous, and the activism that's done by groups that are predominantly white. And the common factor between the two, the thing that divides the two is the manner of resistance, because if you look at the indigenous resistance to the pipelines, whether it's the Trans-Mountain Pipeline, Coastal GasLink, there seems to be this emphasis on civil disobedience and the importance of resistance through nonviolent direct action. And we see this in the form of the Wet'suwet'en railway blockades that were happening right before the pandemic. And I think what we learned from that is the fact that the civil resistance model, which is that the civil resistance model is basically that, for example, if you have a dictatorship in the global south and it's a terrible dictatorship, people realize that it's not viable to take up arms against the state. So there's sort of an emphasis on nonviolent resistance by taking up space in public spaces and sort of overpowering the authorities, because the way in which that works is that if the authorities face a sense of dilemma where you have them somewhere where if they do start arresting people at a high rate, or if they don't, it's a win for the movement either way. So if people take an intersection or a railway blockade, and if the police then is sort of tends to be sort of confused about what to do about it, especially if it's a lot of people, because and especially if people are willing to get arrested, because if the police allows for the people to stay on the intersections or the railway blockades, then it's a win for the movement. And if it insists on arresting them, then it's also a win for the movement. And that's what we see, especially in the global south, when the more repressive the state is, the more, ironically, the more the movement grows when there's crackdown by authority. And one example of this would be, for example, the Salt March in India, where the idea of the Salt March was Gandhi said that he was going to go to the beach and start picking up salt with 70 followers, and that's another thing about the civil resistance model and nonviolent direct action, is that it's usually very simple acts. So an act like picking up salt from the beach, it sounds very straightforward, and but it happens to be the case that it's completely illegal. So when people take part in actions that are seemingly simple but happen to be completely illegal, and the fear of the authority breaks down, that's when the system can successfully be overpowered. Now, on the issue of economic growth and the alternatives that are suggested by a lot of people about, one alternative would be the idea of donut economics. And the obvious problem with donut economics is that it doesn't focus on the actual reason why we're in the mess, which is that a small group of people control the means of production. And when you have a system where a small group of people control the means of production, then that allows those people to manipulate the system in any way that they have to. And that's what we see with the pandemic. And we should also then remember that both the climate crisis and the pandemic can't really be perceived to be good for the ruling class, because it's an opportunity for the ruling class to consolidate power. And that's what we've seen in the pandemic, which is that it gave, because there was such a long sort of period of small businesses shutting down and workers being unemployed, it allowed for bigger corporations to consolidate power by expanding production and gaining more power in that manner. And so in a post-pandemic world, it's going to be it's going to be bad for the majority of the people, but it's going to be good for people who are in power, because it allows them to consolidate power. And when it comes to the economic growth and the need for capitalism to constantly expand production, if you look at pre-colonial societies and how pre-colonial societies operated, especially in the Western Hemisphere, in the indigenous and the First Nations populations before colonialism, there's in many communities, there was the concept of producing as much as we need to. And there's a good story where we learn about this, where Christopher Columbus, who was somewhere in the global south, somewhere in South America, and was on an expedition there, he at one point realized that he couldn't go back with his troops to his native country, and had realized that he would need to stay in the South American continent and that location for a longer period of time. But the problem was that he didn't have enough food for the entire troops. And so he went to the local indigenous population and he told them that they needed food for the troops to stay until like a month. And they were told that there's nothing they could do about it because they only produce as much as needed by people in the community and they don't produce a surplus. Now, what Columbus did then was that he told them about an eclipse that was going to take place soon because he had the scientific knowledge, and he basically told them that he was a deity and that he could predict this thing that is going to happen. And once it started happening, he was successful in coercing the local population of giving them the food, and it resulted in the population ended up starving. And so this brings us to the issue of whether or not scientific innovation and scientific knowledge should be under democratic control. Because when it comes to the climate crisis, and if you look at the example I just mentioned, if regardless of how much progress we make scientifically or with regards to how to tackle climate change, if that knowledge and the tools to implement that knowledge are concentrated in the hands of a few individuals, that will lead to just a more consolidation of power at the worst, and at best, it's going to lead to acts of misuse. And so when it comes to tackling the climate crisis, it needs to happen in a planned, democratic manner, because if we leave the tools of the implementation of these policies up to the people in power, then this is going to be viewed by many as an opportunity to consolidate more power, because in order to tackle climate change, it requires an approach that where we deploy emergency measures. And the important thing about emergency measures is that although they might be necessary in terms of dealing with the climate crisis, it matters whether or not those emergency measures are deployed in a democratic manner or by a small group of people. So when we resist in terms of the pipelines that we're resisting, or when we fight the climate crisis, it needs to be with an approach that the only way in which this can be solved isn't through the parliamentary solution, where a party can easily be elected and choose to invoke emergency measures and consolidate power in that manner. But instead, it should be taking place in a manner where communities are given back control of production, and so that they can plan in a more democratic and coordinated manner. And so I'll just briefly talk about something that's happening in Vancouver and how this informs our settler and colonial perspective on the climate crisis, which is that there's a trial taking place in Vancouver for 3 Indigenous land defenders who are being convicted for criminal contempt of court by the Crown for violating the 2018 injunction on Burnaby Mountain that was placed where there were hundreds of arrests 2 years ago because of opposition to the Trans Mountain expansion. And there are 3 land defenders who are being tried for the same violating that injunction recently. And the interesting thing that came out of the trial was that the defense brought in an anthropologist who was supposed to talk about Indigenous law and why Indigenous law absolves the 3 individuals on trial for doing what they were doing. And part of Coast Salish law, according to the anthropologist who has devoted his life to studying this law, is that many Indigenous individuals are obligated to defend the land and the environment and the water for the future 7 generations, and as a gratitude to the previous 7. Now, these arguments are generally dismissed by the judge, and the reason for that is because it's sort of built into the system. Because as the Crown, as the judge, you're supposed to defend the state and what has been deemed to be good by the state. So there's a dogma surrounding economic growth, that economic growth is good, and one way to facilitate that economic growth is through pipelines. And because economic growth is good for people, and because we needed pipelines to do that, therefore pipelines are good for the people. And if anyone resists that, that needs to be suppressed. And so that's where the courts come in, and the courts are very quick to dismiss Indigenous law, although there are some legal rules that do allow for considering indigenous law in trials. But when it comes to the trials of land defenders who sort of are trying to oppose the pipeline expansions, there seems to be an ignorance of that potential approach. And the reason for that is that capitalism is not allowed to, under capitalism, if there is a capitalist or a group of capitalists who care and try to plan for the long term and something like the future 7 generations, then that's something that will get them outcompeted. And the idea of gratitude to the previous 7 also isn't useful for the course, because, as you know, the state was involved in genocide against the previous 7. So when it comes to the which tells us that these legal avenues and these legal institutions that exist under capitalism have very serious limitations, where a very basic concept of protecting the environment for the future 7 generations is something that it isn't dependent on the individual decisions made by individual judges. It's something that is inherently built into the system that cannot be allowed for. And when it comes to the climate crisis, this becomes especially important because in the next 2-3 generations, we face the very real threat of billions of people potentially starving to death as a result of crop failure. And the reason for that is that there tends to be this assumption that we have this entire planet, and when in fact the facts are that it's really just 12 inches of soil that allow for all the food that we eat. And if you remove those 12 inches of soil, then that means that people die. And when it comes to farming, we know much of the farming takes place in the global south and in former colonies, and if that are now specially hooked onto and are made to be dependent on the global economy and the manner in which factory farming works. And if that system of production continues, and the other issue with farming is that farming, when it comes to how much we need under capitalism, requires constant growth, and constant growth for farming requires the destruction of thousands of acres of rainforests, as happens in Indonesia and parts of Amazon, because there's this need for constant growth. And when it comes to farming and producing the food we need, we could easily imagine a scenario where if this were to take place in a democratic and planned manner, then all the food that would be produced would be as much as is needed by the populations. And under capitalism, the farming is conducted in a manner where farmers are required to produce more, because more than what's actually consumed. And so there's this problem of underconsumption and overproduction. So which results in the one, it results in a great deal of waste, and secondly, it is also disproportionately distributed, because even though there's more food than is consumed, it also ends up being the case that many people, hundreds of thousands of people, end up starving because of not having access to the food due to the way in which the market works. And so when it comes to the climate crisis, there's a lot to be learned from the pandemic, because the climate crisis is something that's going to result in more pandemics because of pressure on the ecological systems. And the other thing about the pandemic is that, the other thing about the climate crisis is that the issue of migration, which is that we already have the issue of migration that is perceived to be a problem. And as a result of the climate crisis, when half the world is inhabitable and food cannot be grown in half the world, it's going to result in mass migration that hasn't been seen before, which obviously leads to more imperialism and more war and more bloodshed. And so when it comes to the resistance to, or trying to do something about the climate crisis, a good model to look at would be a model that's generally used by indigenous direct action groups here in Canada, and is usually NGOs who are predominantly white environmental NGOs tend to be hesitant in using that model. And the fact of the matter is that the social science suggests us that it works, because nonviolent direct action is easy to, with nonviolent direct action, it's easy to get more people on our side, and it's easier to overpower the system. and it's something that there's precedent for in colonial occupied territories to oppose the people in power through this model. And when it comes to sort of bridging the gap between the two divides in the environmental movement, an important part of that is going to have to be recognizing the idea that the system is what's inherently broken, and any opposition requires breaking the law in a manner that overpowers the system and can get more people on our side, due to the nature of the climate crisis, which is that it's one could view this as like the worst potential crisis because of three reasons. One is that it's exponential, as I mentioned. The other is that it's universal because it affects everywhere on the planet and everyone. And the third issue would be that it's existential. So it's, one could call it a trinity from hell, because it threatens civilization in three most important ways. And therefore, because the issue is so universal, it's easy to get more people on our side. And the obvious solution is that it cannot be done within the framework of capitalism, and requires a transition out of it into a model where production is conducted in a manner where people who actually are involved in the consequences of it, which is the majority of the population, are actually involved in the decision making of how it's actually run, which is the workers. And so that it's planned and coordinated in a manner where economic growth is halted, and because it will have to be halted if you have to prevent the climate crisis. And it needs to be planned in a manner where power and scientific knowledge and scientific innovation isn't concentrated into the hands of a few individuals. So I'll just end with the quote I learned about recently from Marx, which is that capitalism ruins the only two sources of its wealth, which is the soil and the worker. And so that's important to remember when we talk about the resistance to the climate crisis, and resistance to the people in power who seek to benefit from it.
All right, thanks, Zain. Now we have some time for discussion. So if you want to speak, again, you can either raise your hand in the Zoom using the links on the bottom, or you can indicate in the chat that you'd like to speak. So if anybody has any questions or comments or anything that's sparked by the discussion so far, that would be great. And I'll mention also at the end, we'll have a couple of minutes for each speaker to respond to questions. All right, so I have Virginia on the speakers list.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me, Alex? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I'm in the car. So I live outside of Washington, D.C., and obviously this has sparked a lot of of contradictions in my head at the moment because of what's happening, you know, with the whole kind of White House super spreader events going on. And the massive contradiction we have as in terms of the president's actions here in the States. So I think the moment has quickly passed in terms of like overwhelming sympathy for somebody who has contracted COVID. And instead, it seems like, you know, the American people are open to critiquing, you know, the president's actions around COVID. And pointing out how, you know, as he's slashing medical coverage and access to healthcare for millions of Americans, he had the best example of socialized medicine. I mean, he's under its care right now. So there's like a massive contradiction, you know, and obviously all the claims from him that it was a hoax and, you know, no masks and all this business. And then like taking a step back in terms of like what we're talking about in this panel, about all he has done in his administration to cut environmental protections in the midst of what we're experiencing in this country, like with the wildfires and the flooding and the tornadoes. So So I think, you know, just what Chantal was talking about in terms of like the contradictions that we're seeing. Another one that has nothing to do with Trump, with Jeff Bezos, is we've been seeing a lot of coverage of the 20,000 and growing Amazon workers who have contracted COVID, you know, as Bezos is on his way to becoming a trillionaire. And then in terms of what Zain was talking about, it got me thinking about, are we prepared to have responses when a vaccine is developed, and then we have the problematic pharmaceutical industry, you know, that controls the science and who gets access to life-saving drugs and scientific advances in technology. So what can we do to be prepared to make sure that there's equal access for everyone at no cost or low cost? So thank you very much to the speakers, and that's what I have to say. Thanks.
Okay, I now have Brian.
Hello, sorry, I'll get my video going too. Okay, great presentations from both our speakers, and it really showed like essentially how deep the crisis is that we're in, and the clear need for revolutionary transformation. And you know, I just wanted to, some of the things I've been looking at in recently around what Marx talked about these questions, and how, and also like responding to some of the you know, critiques of Marx that came out recently. John Bellamy Foster has written on Marx Monthly Review online about how actually, you know, Marx really saw okay, so Marx talked about the robbery of the land, or the expropriation of the land. And in the colonial context, this meant, and it means, in the current state, the removing of indigenous peoples from the land so that it can be used for agriculture, mining, pipelines, etc. But Marx also taught, and you know, I mean, a lot of discussions talk about that in the context of what a good translation of what Marx talked about would be original accumulation. And but he also talked about the exploitation at the point of production, and how in the modern context these are happening simultaneously. And I think the real hope that this provides is that actually, as we saw earlier this year with the Shut Down Canada movement, where which is, you know, the land back movement is part of the same thread, and what it points to is a potential revolutionary alliance between workers and indigenous people fighting back against the same system that is capitalism. So workers forging those alliances at the point of production to halt that production and bring about the sort of democracy that Zain was talking about, and as well, you know, indigenous peoples fighting to maintain the traditional ways on the land, which is the source of, you know, everything for them, and that actually that we need to have these ideas, as Zain was talking about, in terms of the looking for the 7th generation down the line. So I think there's real hope in this moment for that reason, and so I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, next I have Michelle.
Thank you, and yeah, thanks to both the speakers. It's really made me think a lot about the moment that we're in. I'm sure everyone on this conference is feeling the same in terms of just the pace at which things are moving, and the contradictions that are constantly being like just exposed so nakedly. Almost in every single thing that has been raised by the speakers today, you can just see colossal contradictions. And what it means is that millions upon millions of people, like hundreds of millions of people, whose lives are being upended by different aspects of what we're talking about, the economic crisis, the COVID crisis, the climate crisis, are looking for explanations and a way forward. We have no choice. People who are confronted with these problems personally and in their communities have to try and make sense of it and find a way forward. Unfortunately, a lot of the things that are being put forward, like yesterday in this city, in Toronto, where I am, there was an anti-mask protest, which apparently the leader of the right-wing People's Party, Maxime Bernier, was going to join. You know, there are conspiracy theories being put forward by the far right that basically fuel anti-Semitic points of view, racist points of view, and so on. So there are other ideas competing out there. And I think I want to agree with what Brian just talked about the hopefulness right now is that by and large, those ideas are not the dominant ones. You've just had the magnificent eruption of a movement for Black lives, not just throughout the United States in response to George Floyd's murder, but around the world, that is still rippling through, that is still having an impact in communities around the world. And that shows that, you know, a movement like that erupts can fundamentally change how people see key things in our society, how people see the police, the role of the police, who are they there for, where did they come from, why are they funded so colossally, and what else could we do with those funds, and all of those questions. That's just one example, but I think the resistance of the Wet'suwet'en people in the early part of this year before the COVID lockdown similarly raised huge questions about, you know, about why is it that when Indigenous people win in the courts, in the, you know, Supreme Court of this land, Supreme Court of Canada, in the Delgamuukw decision that says the hereditary chiefs in the Wet'suwet'en territories, they are the rightful owners of that land, and that's unceded territory, and they have the right to that land. How is it the RCMP is sent in there over and over again to arrest them and remove them from their own land? And I think the sympathy we saw in that movement, I mean, you know, COVID has kind of, in a way, like displaced that struggle in a sense from how front page it was. But it was very hopeful because there were moments of intersection where you could see what we look to as socialists, the power of the organized, or of the working class to uproot the system, an intersection there. And they're small glimpses, but it points to also the importance of socialists, of organized socialists intervening in there. And I just want to read, just to finish on this, is that during that struggle, there was a Via Rail shop steward in the East Coast who posted on Facebook a very long statement about why he was supporting the Wet'suwet'en struggle and why every trade unionist should. And I'll just read, we interviewed him for Socialist.Ca, and he said, as a labor activist in a leadership role in my local, Unifor 4005, I felt I needed to show and tell my members and anyone else who cared to listen that we can't be narrowly focused on our own short-term interests in any conflict between marginalized people or workers on one side and corporations and neoliberal governments on the other. I wanted to make clear that solidarity can't begin and end with our coworkers. The labor movement is weakened enormously if it doesn't extend solidarity to broader social justice issues, that we have more common cause with First Nations than we do with the Liberal Party of Canada, CN Rail, and Coastal GasLink. And I think that if that message was multiplied everywhere, if we were able to orchestrate that, and it was accompanied with the statements that we got from the BC Government Employees Union, BC Teachers Federation, the Ontario Federation of Labor, a whole bunch of labor organizations did speak out. I think that that poses the question of the contradiction very starkly and is hopeful. So anyways, thank you again to the speakers. It's been really stimulating.
Okay, so I next have John Bell.
Hi there, everybody, and thanks for the presentation, and thanks everybody for being here. Just following on from what Zain was talking about and Michelle, in terms of the importance of Indigenous leadership in the environmental movement and any movement for social justice, is that not just the traditional relationship that those folks have with the environment and the land and the water and whatnot, but also that they are free of one of the fundamental shackles that holds back the rest of us, which is that they don't have any illusions in the state. They don't have illusions that the state is going to deliver something beneficial for them. And so that's their starting point, which is one that we as Marxists agree with. And it's a liberating, in many sense, it's a liberating component to the struggle, and it helps to elevate things, to bring about to bring to the fore the need that, well, we just can't get on our knees and beg the state for something. We have to fight for it. And when that is your starting premise, then you're starting from a much better place. The enormity of the crises that we're facing is daunting. And I feel that pressure. I'm sure that the majority of the people who are on this forum today are also feeling that pressure, that the tasks before us seem almost insurmountable. But I'd like to point out something that I found and posted to my Facebook page yesterday, which is that there have been over 1,000 wildcat strikes and work disruptions in the United States since COVID started. Over 1,000. That is quite amazing in a country which has a shockingly low percentage of unionized workers. So that's mainly low-paid people of color, frontline workers who are going on strike for dignity, safety in the context of this crisis, where they're saying, we're not going to be the cannon fodder. We are not going to be the dead bodies. We are not going to take this sitting down. So they're striking for safety. They're striking for danger pay. They're striking for recognition, and they're striking for dignity. And that is a very encouraging thing. It's not going to be front page news anyplace else, but in the kind of media that we collectively can create, support, and spread. And I just want to put in a little plug for publications like Socialist Worker, like the website that we sustain, Socialist.Ca, where we post up information and stories like that. So if everybody can get on board to check out, contribute. If you see a story that you think needs to be shared, write it and send it to us, that we can put it up on our website and disseminate it. If you see a story that you like it, share it, and that helps get the word out about the resistance that is out there. But the mainstream media is not going to spread that news. That's up to us, and that's where people will get their inspiration to fight back. I'll see that somebody over there in New York City is doing it. Somebody over there in Portland, Oregon is doing it. Somebody over there in Brandon, Manitoba is doing it. We can do it here too. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so I next have Faylene on the speakers list.
Hello. Yes, thank you very much for those presentations. I think they were really kind of thought-provoking and really gave us a kind of global view of what's happening. And then particularly when you were talking about how change happens, you know, that it's not through the parliamentary system fundamentally, that it's actually people themselves organizing. So how do we make gains? How do we organize? And I think I'm thinking of two examples here and in the United States. As people have mentioned before the pandemic, if you look at the solidarity actions, at the activism, at the blockades that were going on across Canada, led by Indigenous peoples, the anti-pipeline demonstrations, the land defenders, I think it was probably the first time in living memory, or perhaps in the history of the country, that you saw such large mobilizations that included large numbers of non-Indigenous people, that their courageous actions actually spurred other Canadians to participate in those. And if you look at what's happened during the pandemic in the United States with the eruption of Black Lives Matter, which started, you know, partially around the murder of George Floyd, but have continued. They galvanized a movement that spread to other people of color, but also to white communities, so that you saw across, and you still see across the United States, even in places where there are predominantly white populations, people going out on the streets in support of Black Lives Matter. And if you look at the way that Trump has come down on that, with the National Guard, with, you know, with basically talking about having to squelch these rioters and these people that are threatening whatever, you know, peace and security in the United States, why is the ruling class so worried about these manifestations? I think they're worried because they see the possibility of this sentiment spreading throughout the population in the United States, which is what the strikes have been about that John just mentioned. And it made me think of something that Marx wrote a long time ago, where he's writing about the beginnings of capitalism. And he talks about the rosy dawn of capitalism and how it was a system that came dripping with dirt and blood. And if you think about the foundation of US capitalism and Canadian capitalism, what were they founded on? In the US, they were founded on the institution of slavery and racism against Blacks. And that has continued up to the present moment in terms of being a history of oppression and exploitation in the United States. And similarly in Canada, how was the Canadian state founded? It was founded on the theft of the land and wealth of Indigenous peoples. And it's also founded or continues because it constantly tries to divide and conquer. So to make us believe, if we're not Indigenous, that Indigenous people are the problem. But I think that narrative is breaking down as people move into their own activity. So I think the point that you were making, Zain, is incredibly important. How do we actually make fundamental change? Not by looking to our governments, not by looking to our political leaders, because they are part and parcel of the system that has kept these systems of exploitation in place. Now we can push them, and I think the question, for example, in the United States of the new the Supreme Court justice that the Republicans are putting forward, you know, and how this may threaten Roe versus Wade. If you look back at when Roe versus Wade, you know, how did women win abortion rights in the United States? It was in a Supreme Court that was presided over by Richard Nixon, who was no liberal. But the thing that forced the Supreme Court, in a sense, to bring Roe versus Wade, to basically give women the right to choose, was that women were not waiting for that. They were demonstrating, they were organizing, and that's really a lesson for us, I think, in the current crisis. Thanks.
Okay, so that was a great discussion, everyone. So our plan is to take a short break at 2:10, and the next session will be starting at 2:20, which is Smash Racism, Black Lives Matter, and Indigenous Sovereignty. But until that time, we have a very brief couple of minutes for each speaker to come back if you would like to, and say a couple of extra words, comments. So I'll start with Chantal.
Thanks. Just to say that I agreed with everything that was said in the discussion, but just to say that I really appreciated also the comments from Virginia about what's going on in the States right now, because a lot of us are paying close attention to that. So that was wonderful to hear. And also what John Bell said about the over 1,000 wildcat strikes in the US. And I think what's important for us in Canada is that sometimes there can be a smugness or a complacency just in terms of when we see how bad the crisis is in the US. However, the resistance that's coming out of the US as well is something that we have to celebrate and not be smug about at all, as we hear our politicians try to make us feel like our side of the border is somehow solving the problem of the crisis in a way that's fundamentally better. And I very much agree with the hopefulness and the question of intersection. The possibility of solidarity is very, very real. And I guess I'm thinking about the saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. Because we know that the ruling class thinks about that from their perspective. They try to use crisis for their interests. We need to not let this crisis go to waste in the sense that it is producing a great deal of solidarity and connection that we have to build on. And Zain give a really sweeping account of how historically people learn through their own struggle what their power is. And that's incredibly important. We know we all keep rediscovering that power over and over again in our own struggles. But I think what's also really important is to consciously protect and preserve the lessons, preserve that learning that people have gained through struggle so that it doesn't always have to be relearned all over again. And we can make visible to others that their power lies with their own ability to change the world, and not from external factors that are constantly given to us as the only solution. And so I think that's really fundamentally what socialists try to do, is to make visible to people themselves, ordinary people themselves, the power that they actually have.
Thanks, Chantal. Zain, would you like to make a short couple of comments?
Oh, sure. I was reminded about this quote by Lenin, which is that before the Russian Revolution, when people were within the communist socialist movement were worried about nothing happening, and Lenin was asked why that is, and he responded by saying that there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. I think that's what we're seeing with the crisis of capitalism right now, where for the longest time, if you were alive in the 1990s or the early 2000s, you probably thought that it's going to be around, this capitalism is going to be around forever. But what Lenin said here isn't just like a dogmatic assertion, it sort of holds up with the social science, which is that when something hits people in the face, so there's a climate crisis and people know about the climate crisis for decades, and it's sort of just another issue, and people tend to think of it as polar bears or the orcas, which are all important, but the fact of the matter is it's something that threatens human existence. And because it does, and when something hits people in the face, so for example, like the smoke we saw recently in Vancouver because of the wildfires, or something more extreme than that, then people get panicked and they elect, for example, reformists historically, or something like the Green Party. And when they do elect them, they realize that they're completely useless because they don't really have the revolutionary solutions that are needed to actually deal with these crises. And so, yeah, I just think that's important to remember, that in order to have a successful transformation of the economic system, people who believe in revolutionary change, but during the period where people are sort of just going along and things haven't sort of hit the fan, that people who are in the radical end of the movement should remain there regardless of whether or not there's a lot of support. And when the actual crisis hits people in the face, then usually what happens is that there's a process of electing the reformists and then learning that the reformists aren't actually doing anything, and then actually electing the radicals, which is what we saw in the Russian Revolution or in many revolutions throughout history.
Okay, thanks everyone. So we have a couple minutes to break before our next session starts, and it'd be great if you could all join us for the next session at 2:20. Thanks.